The alien prisoner huddled in the far corner of her cell, her skin pulsing faintly with the soft glow of her species' natural bioluminescence, a trait that betrayed her attempts to disappear into the shadows. In the dim light, her mind raced with tales of humans, ruthless, cold-blooded creatures who devoured anything weaker than themselves. She'd heard horror stories, whispered warnings about humans' brutal strength and insatiable hunger, their kind so unlike her own, who valued harmony and diplomacy. They were the carnivores, the apex predators whose cruelty was matched only by their capacity for deception. Every sense heightened in her fear, she shivered at the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor outside her cell. Her heart pounded, sending quick pulses of light across her skin. The story she'd been told as a child flashed in her mind. Images of terrifying human faces with fierce eyes, sharp tools, and expressions that seemed devoid of empathy. Humans were always the monsters in those tales, beings to be feared and avoided at all costs. When the footsteps stopped outside her cell and the door creaked open, she was certain this was the end. As the door slid open, the alien instinctively flinched, her glowing skin flickering in fear. She expected a towering figure of menace, a human with a cold, calculating stare and brutal strength. Instead, the figure who stepped into the dim light was quiet and controlled. He moved slowly, his body language careful and almost gentle. His face softened as he took in her cowering form, his brow furrowing with something that looked like concern rather than hostility. The human, tall and clad in dark armor that looked strangely organic yet cold, extended a hand toward her. She tensed, preparing to defend herself, though she knew she was no match for him. But his hand didn't reach out to strike her or to take hold of her by force. Instead, it hovered in the air between them, palm facing upward, as if an invitation rather than command. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not the sharp, predatory gleam she had feared, but a calm, steady gaze that seemed to search for her trust. The expression on his face was one of openness, as though he understood her fear. In his outstretched hand, there was no weapon, only a quiet reassurance. Seeing that she hadn't fled or lashed out, the human carefully reached into a pouch on his side and pulled out a small silver vial, the metal glinting faintly in the dimness of the cell. She watched, eyes wide, as he uncapped it and poured a small amount of a translucent liquid onto his gloved fingertips. Her instincts urged her to retreat, to avoid whatever strange substance he was preparing, but there was something almost reverent in the way he handled it. Slowly, and with his movements carefully measured, he gestured to the raw wound on her arm. She glanced down at the injury, a painful cut she'd received during her capture, and felt a fresh stab of pain as she instinctively drew it closer to her body. But he didn't press or insist. He simply waited, showing her the vial and the faintly shimmering liquid, then gesturing gently toward her wound again. Reluctantly, she extended her arm, watching his every movement. The human brought his hand close, applying the liquid to her wound with a feather-light touch. Her body tensed at the sensation, but instead of the sharp sting she anticipated, a cool, soothing relief spread over the injury. She watched in awe as the skin began to knit itself back together, the burning pain fading almost instantly. He continued with a steady focus, his touch surprisingly delicate, as if he was as aware of her fear as she was. He didn't speak, only worked in silence, the edges of his mouth softening into a barely perceptible smile as he noticed her astonishment. She glanced up at him, searching his face for any sign of hidden intent, but all she saw was a quiet patience that disarmed her even more than his touch. As the minutes passed, the alien felt her initial fear begin to soften, though wariness still lingered. This human, who had entered her cell with an uncharacteristic gentleness, was unlike the ruthless figures she had been taught to dread. But her mind battled against itself, clinging to her ingrained fears and suspicions even as his actions showed nothing of the monstrous nature she had expected. He stepped back slightly after tending to her wound, allowing her space, and she watched him closely, her gaze sharp and uncertain. The human seemed to understand, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. She found herself studying him, the subtle creases in his brow, the way his eyes softened when they met hers, and the lack of aggression in his posture. Everything about him defied the stories that had instilled her deep-rooted distrust. Despite herself, she began to wonder if he could truly be different from the terrifying creatures she'd heard so much about. Each moment that passed without any threat of harm chipped away at the fortress of fear she'd built around herself. Her mind fought against the unfamiliar warmth rising in her chest, telling herself to remain vigilant, to guard against the possibility that this was all a ruse. Yet as she observed him, she caught glimpses of an earnestness in his every action, as though he were waiting patiently for her to recognize it. The thought unsettled her, stirring questions she couldn't yet understand, but she felt herself loosening, her guard lowering bit by bit in response to his steady, unchanging kindness. Over time, as the human continued to visit her cell, something shifted between them. A delicate and improbable bond formed from shared glances, gestures, and silence. Though words were scarce and often lost in translation, they began to communicate through a language of small actions. His offering of water, her hesitant acceptance of a nutrient bar, his silent reassurance in the moments when her fear resurfaced. She began to understand that he was not her captor, nor was he interested in exploiting her vulnerabilities. During one visit, he showed her a map of the facility, tracing escape routes with his finger and glancing up to see if she understood. She studied the map, recognizing his plan to help her, and for the first time, a spark of hope began to grow within her. Trust was still fragile between them, but the realization that he intended to risk his safety for hers created a bond that defied the natural instincts of both their species. With each encounter, they exchanged more than simple gestures. She learned to see him beyond the frightening tales, to understand the complexity behind his strange, stoic expressions. When he reached for her arm one day to help her stand, she did not pull back. Instead, she allowed his grip to steady her, feeling a strange solidarity in his touch. Together, they studied the map, exchanged small nods of understanding, and prepared for the night they would make their escape. Despite the uncertainty that loomed ahead, she felt the unfamiliar sensation of security in his presence, a feeling that transcended the fear and suspicion that had once defined her thoughts of his kind. Each step they planned and each silent exchange built an alliance that was as unspoken as it was powerful, built from mutual respect and an inexplicable understanding of each other's vulnerability. As the days passed, the alien began to view the human not as a creature to be feared, but as an individual who defied everything she had been taught. Every act of kindness, every moment of patience, unraveled her deeply ingrained beliefs. The human was compassionate, respectful of her boundaries, and seemed to understand her fear without judgment or frustration. Her initial certainty in the savagery of humans softened as she noticed subtle but powerful details. The careful way he interacted with her, the gentle tone in his voice, the genuine concern that crept into his expression whenever she looked weary or hurt. Slowly, she began to let go of her assumptions, replacing them with newfound curiosity. She wondered how many other beliefs were merely misunderstandings, born from fear rather than truth. The human, who she had once seen as a ruthless predator, became a source of security and comfort in the bleak surroundings of her cell. She questioned the old tales, the dark rumors that painted his kind as little more than cunning monsters. Perhaps, she considered, those stories had come from fear, a fear of the unknown, a fear of what her people couldn't understand. Each time he entered her cell, he brought with him a small glimpse of humanity that shattered the old stereotypes she held. He showed her images of his home planet, explaining with pride and reverence the beauty of his world and the diversity of his people. She listened, fascinated, as he spoke of families, friendships, and the communities that shaped his kind, images that starkly contrasted the brutal tales she'd grown up hearing. For the first time, she glimpsed a version of humanity that was as vulnerable and hopeful as her own people. In these quiet moments, she began to realize that what separated them was not so vast after all. Her perception shifted, and the walls built by fear and prejudice began to crumble, replaced by an unexpected connection and a profound sense of understanding. On the night of their planned escape, the alien and the human moved in quiet unison through the maze-like corridors, every step bringing them closer to freedom. Their alliance, once a tenuous bond formed out of necessity, had transformed into something far deeper, a trust neither could have anticipated. When they reached the final door, the human glanced back, meeting her gaze with a nod that spoke volumes. She responded with a hesitant but grateful smile, a gesture that seemed to seal the friendship they'd built through every shared glance and unspoken promise. Together, they stepped out into the open night, breathing in the fresh air of a world that was finally theirs to share. For a long, silent moment, they both took it in, feeling the weight of freedom and the bond that had allowed them to reach it. In that moment, she knew she would never look at his kind in the same way again, nor would she allow the stories of fear to cloud her perception of others. He, too, understood that his perspective had been changed forever. As they walked into the unknown together, their steps held a rhythm of resilience and unity, a reminder that even the vast chasms between species could be bridged by understanding and kindness. Their journey had redefined not just their perceptions of each other, but also their beliefs in what was possible when compassion and courage replaced fear. With a final glance at one another, they set off, knowing their worlds had both changed forever.